How are y'all? I'm good too. My name is Melanie Jones. I am a PhD candidate at Chicago Theological Seminary, doing work on Womanist theological ethics, and I also am teaching this year at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Megan is one of my students. Will you be in my next class this semester? Okay, awesome. So welcome to I Found God in Me, Womanist preaching in a millennial age. And I am looking forward to us having a very exciting conversation. Since it seems like we're going to have a smaller group, it will probably be even better because we'll be able to get a little bit more intimate. First things first, what I want everyone to do is go ahead to www.sly.do, and there is a poll. If you do hashtag if not for womanism, you'll be able to connect to the class poll. And as you have questions throughout the class, they'll come up in the poll, and then we'll be able to respond to those questions. And everyone will see questions that were asked. I'll go to them specifically at the end of the class to go back through those questions, but it's a way for me to keep knowledge of questions that you might have for this presentation and for us to see what others' thoughts are. All right? Cool. Since it's such a small group, I'm interested in what attracted you, what brought you to this workshop or this masterclass on this afternoon. So jump on in, give me your name and what brought you here. Yeah.
My name is Nyla. I go to Wesley Theological Seminary in D.C.
Awesome.
And our teacher we took a class on African American hermeneutics, and she kind of just sprinkled in, Mitzi Smith and Bernita Weems and all of these people, and I was like, I need to know more about this. So I just happened to find this in the thing, in the bulletin, so I was excited to kind of step in and see what's going on.
Awesome. Others? Why are you here? What brought you?
My name is Tashana Morgan. I attend Truett Theological Seminary. One of my mentors, Dr. Iris Sessions, that I follow.
She's a bright, yeah?
Every day that I follow, Dr. Will Gaffney that I follow.
This is the whole bright row, yes.
I really wanted to attend Bright, but because I live in the Parker Heights area, I was not willing to make that 2.5-hour commute. But I have learned so much by participating and supporting Dr. Gaffney, Dr. Sessions, and Dr. Day, that it just seemed only fitting that I would sit in on this session.
Awesome. One more. What brought you here? Why is this workshop attractive? What are you seeking to learn? Just want to hear what's happening in the room. What do we bring? What are our intentions for this space?
Okay, so
Yeah.
my name is Morgan Britt. I'm from Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a children's minister intern. And I go to the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky. What drew me to this was I grew up in a small town with everything about women seemed traditional and whatnot. So knowing the history of women between white and black, doesn't matter what age or color, there was not, and there's always a stereotype about women either cook, clean, whatever, the typical stereotype. And me, I'm breaking out of that tradition from back home. I'm originally from Kansas. So a small town, country town, knowing how women are important through history, through the Bible, and seeing the difference that they have made, and understanding how I can make a difference just as much as anybody else can.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome again to I Found God in Me. And what that comes from is, any of you seen For Color Girls? The movie comes from the choreo poem by Ntozake Shange called For Color Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Was Enough. And the hallmark line is actually the final line of the entire choreo poem. It is, I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely. I've paired that with Shug's conversation with Celie in The Color Purple. And she says, Celie, tell the truth. Have you ever found God in church? I never did. I just found a bunch of folks hoping for him to show. Any God I ever felt in church, I brought in with me. And I think all the other folks did too. They come to church to share God, not find God. The thing I believe, God is inside you and inside everybody else. You come into the world with God, but only them that search for it inside find it. And sometimes it just manifests itself even if you're not looking or don't know what you're looking for. And I thought that was a perfect framing to think about womanist preaching in a millennial age, particularly because I found God in me brings a new kind of theological anthropology to the question of what we've been wrestling with, which is incarnational preaching. And the sense that for millennial audiences and for many of you who might be millennial preachers, there is a sense that folks are not coming to church to find God. They're coming to share God, to bring the God that they have in with them. It's no more the sense that the preacher is the only one who can herald God talk, right? Folks are coming in the door with clear understanding of the God or the sense of divine that is already inside of them. So with that, my intention today is kind of around four kind of main points. It is this tension that exists. Perhaps you've heard that millennials are disinterested in religion, right? This has become the somewhat overgeneralized catchphrase from Pew Research Center to blogs. Millennials are leaving the church, right? And sometimes this, again, has not been reflective of the many of you, right, who are in this room, who are in church and perhaps are preaching or who are extending your pulpits beyond the church space into other platforms and thinking and rethinking your images of the divine. Part of this gets to ways in which millennial preaching women in particular have been integrating womanist theologies and why there is a particular kind of coalescing that is happening between millennial experiences and womanist experience that open way or make space for the sermonic moment to become a point of departure for radical love on top is what I call it, and revolutionary justice. So for our discussion today in this masterclass, I want us to center around four main kind of areas. We're going to talk through some of the methodological pathways for womanist preaching. We're going to get at some of those empirical issues that are facing millennials in particular. We'll look at a few models of millennial womanist preachers, and then we'll talk about the millennial strategies to transition what we say in the pulpit or our sermons on Sunday to the Monday through Saturday, to that kind of larger public platform. Questions as we move? Perfect. So we're going to start with the womanist definition from Alice Walker. And Alice Walker, as many of you are familiar, is the writer of The Color Purple, but is a renowned poet and writer and author in her own right. And womanists, or some of you might have been familiar with the term womanish, as this kind of Black idiomatic expression that speaks to this sense of young girls or knowing themselves or knowing about their world a little bit before their time. So it was kind of a corrective in a sense. You acting womanish, or for boys it could have been you acting mannish. Some way a little bit before your time. You're grown, kind of serious, in charge, responsible. That's the first part. Alice Walker was trying to talk about the experiences, particularly of Black women, that were different from feminism in the 1970s, and its particular focus on white women's experiences. And so she wanted to find a name for how Black women were defining themselves that actually came out of Black women's culture. The second part of this definition is this sense of a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, prefers women's culture, sometimes loves individual men sexually and or non-sexually, But what's most important here is committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. Not a separatist, except periodically for health's sake, right? And there is this exchange or this dialogue between a kind of elder and a younger here about, in one part of it, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me, if we know about Harriet Tubman's language. And the reply becomes, it wouldn't be the first time. So this dialogue about navigating spaces or trailblazing, this is something that happens across generations. And then this, what's at the heart for me of the womanist definition is this concept of love. And this sense of a womanist loves music and dance and the moon and the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. And then lastly, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. As you see this definition, what comes up for you? What strikes you? What images? What thoughts? What emerges for you?
I'm curious about how, as a person with enormous privilege by the coincidence of birth, I might follow womanist leadership and practice womanish through following womanist leadership.
Yeah. My slides are going a little ahead of me. So yeah, part of what we want to do when we talk about methodology, I'm clear that the womanist definition and womanist concept emerges out of Black women's experience. But what womanist theology and methodology helps us to do is to be able to translate that language in terms that seeks to eradicate oppression and struggle for the liberation of all humanity. So this is not a question of can I be or must I be a womanist? This is a question of can you use womanist methodology in the preaching moment, right? And that is where all of us partake in opportunity to be in this conversation. All right. It is true, perhaps for all women, but certainly for Black women, that we can relate with their eyes are watching God and Nanny's kind of statement to Janie, who is the protagonist in Zora's work. I wanted to preach a great sermon on high about colored women sitting on high, but there wasn't no pulpit for me. Wow. So it is this sense, in many ways, that women of color, and again, perhaps all women, because we know patriarchy is in the church, right? And not just Black churches, but have encountered a stained glass ceiling where they are either kind of tokenized, not able to have opportunities at all to preach or to fully live into their witness. And then those that are fully embraced, right, as not only gifted in the church itself, but a part of the strategic plan of the church and its operational design and lineage. That's only a select few in some contexts, right? We can see this on the denominational level, that even what Cheryl Townsend Joke says, if it wasn't for the women, this sense that majority of these churches are comprised by women, but only less than 10% are often in leadership or even in the pulpit, dare I say. And then those denominations that are few that do fully affirm women in ministry, how many of them make it to bishop, right? And how many make it to these kind of larger platforms? So here's where the womanist kind of conversation speaks to this issue and is rooted historically in the experiences of these three women who I name as the womanist trinity. Who reflected on not only what we just discussed as it relates to women's kind of roles and experiences in the church, but also made a corrective of the way in which, even in theology, particularly Black liberation theology, Black women's experiences were not kind of engaged. And then on the other side, the challenge of patriarchy, often with feminist theology, eclipsed the experiences of race and class. So women by the name of Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Grant, Katie Cannon, Dolores Williams, who were all students of James Cone, who was often named the father of Black liberation theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York, were the first to speak back and say, hold up, before we get too far on this kind of Black liberation train, if you will, let's remember, right, Black women. So again, womanist theology emerges roughly 30 years ago, seeking to ask the question, again, critiquing feminist thought and its only kind of single perspective of patriarchy and not embracing those other kinds of forms of oppression or subjugation. And then subsequently as well, Black liberation theology and its kind of singular focus on race without looking at ways in which class and sexuality and gender are all kind of impacting the experiences of Black women. And ultimately help to shape womanist theology and womanist discourse as a paradigm that is interested in eradicating oppression, right, and seeking to bring about the liberation of all humanity and creation. So here are 4 key things that I want you to know when you talk about womanism in theological education. And that is, womanism promotes the liberation and survival of Black women and the entire African American people, but this must be done without prohibiting the wholeness of others and while also advocating against all forms of oppression. Womanism encourages intergenerational bonds between girls and women. There is gifts that must be exchanged from the elders and youngers and the in-between, right? But in order for this exchange to happen, there must be a sense of understanding the wisdom that exists in all of these kind of generational identities. Most importantly, womanism or womanist theology maintains that God or Jesus identifies with the oppressed, the least of these, in their commitment to and struggle for justice and wholeness. I like what Dr. Jacqueline Grant says, Black women identify with Jesus because Jesus identifies with us, right? It is the sense, if you know about the gospel story, right, that women are with Jesus on his journey, right? And not only the text says in Matthew that many women were there, even though we don't always hear their stories or get their names, we know that they were full participants in the gospel. There is no gospel of Jesus Christ without women. And so that is clear within womanist dialogue and conversations. And then lastly, womanism speaks to reclaiming Black women's experiences, histories, bodies, aesthetics, literature as primary sources for theological reflection and biblical interpretation. It is using reclaiming my time, right? And I'm rooting for everybody Black, right? It is looking and seeking for the wisdom that already exists within Black women's culture and making it also divine. So I said all that to say, what is womanist preaching, right? It is prophetic proclamation emerging from the experiences of Black women that calls for transformational justice in the church and society and advocates for the liberation of all humanity, right? So again, womanist preaching is an anti-oppression model, right? That its goal is to, again, eradicate oppression and to seek for the liberation of all humanity, and does this with both kind of a corrective but also a descriptive of Black women's experiences and also experiences of the oppressed or the marginalized or the dispossessed, using those experiences as central for this dialogue and conversation. Questions? Certainly. We will get to that in just a second. I actually have full examples of short sermon clips that we'll watch. All right? Great. So I want you to know that we we just had the kind of short master class with Reverend Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, who's the Bandy Professor of Preaching at Emory. And she is the first to publish on a womanist homiletic. So I want to call her name in this space. But essentially, when she talks about what a womanist homiletic is for 21st century proclaimers, she talks again about it being a liberative discourse for God's people that wants to step out of the status quo and seeking through its language and content to shake the dungeons and make the chains fall off, right? So this is about getting folk free, right? And getting everybody free, right, on the journey. And she says in order to do this, you must have these components. It must be a well-researched, statistically correct, exegetically sound, factual, fictional, topical sermon on any power dynamic that affronts biblical justice imperatives, right? So she's saying this actually is something not only that takes work, but comes in the room addressing what are the power dynamics at work within this text? What are the power dynamics at work within this context? And how do we move out of the status quo, again, to shake the chains, to make kind of this moment and these people in this moment, both within the text and those who are surrounding the pulpit, uncomfortable, right, with injustice, right? She said it seeks to shape voices of resistance and hope ethical indignation, right? Just as it raises question about groups or people or narratives, right, that are resisting the status quo, Teresa Fry Brown says there is also a message of hope, right? Just as we preach justice, right, we also have to preach for Fry Brown and womanist preaching, there must be some lens of hope, some way out, even as we preach these voices of resistance. Womanist preaching is confession, truth-telling, honest analysis that cultivate life in the midst of death, right? That opens up dark spaces, that brings new light and new opportunities and new voices. And then lastly, it's a resistance commitment to pursue justice, discern language of survival, struggle, indictment, again, and hope. If you want to get her text, they're there. Can a sister get a help? Weary throats and delivering the sermon. Wonderful, wonderful. What I also want us to, so that's one pathway. That's the Brown method, if you will. Here, there are other methodological pathways, particularly I'm drawing here on today from Stacey Floyd Thomas' work in Mining, she's also former, right? Mining the Mother Lode, Methods in Womanist Ethics, and she talks about womanist kind of paradigm in four major terms, that being radical subjectivity, and that is these kind of four terms are directly in alignment with Alice Walker's kind of four notions or kind of points within her definition. So in this sense, a womanist is radical because she claims her agency and has a subjective view of the world in which she is not a victim of circumstance, but rather is a responsible, serious, and in charge woman, right? And this is, how do we preach radically subjective? This is even for texts, right, that often do not give women voice or do not give, how will we preach this text in ways that do not make this woman a victim, right? But still makes her in charge. Is it her body that is speaking, right? Is it some other way that we might read and interpret this text that does not just kind of leave her as a damsel in distress? Traditional communalism, right, is this second aspect. My slides are inventive. Okay. Takes into account the various gifts, identities, and concerns of Black people in general in order to use every resource available to strengthen the community as a whole. what you should know is that womanist kind of tradition is committed to community, right? And survival and liberation of people, right? So even as we preach, there are several communities happening even within our church, right? We have our communal congregation, right? We have the community that's happening in the text, and certainly we have the community that is outside, right? Outside of those kind of church walls. So in those ways, what are our texts? What are our sources, right? We need to think of exegeting our biblical texts, right? Exegeting our congregational texts, and also exegeting our communities, right? That means when we prep our sermons, we're watching CNN, we're reading a magazine, we're Facebooking, right? And seeing what's latest on Twitter, right? But we're also engaging in biblical text and also thinking, what is the word for the moment for the people that I'll be speaking to, right? Redemptive self-love. By demystifying the perception of Black women's bodies, ways, and loves as vile, the intentionality with which Black women, she's talking about writers in particular, Black women writers back to their truer selves is invaluable in the formation of womanist ethics. Now, redemptive self-love, right, is, again, back to Walker's notion of loves love, right? Loves the moon, right? Loves food, loves roundness, loves herself regardless, right? Love is certainly at the heart of the womanist discourse. But redemptive self-love is a recognition that often the dispossessed or the oppressed have often been taught not to love themselves, or the ways in which society has read these particular contexts have often been unloving, right? To be marginalized is often to be up against a hostile world, right? So this is a rethinking or a kind of reflection on the ways in which we might think about the thinking, being, and doing continuum of faith that helps us to align back with a sense of loving ourselves, loving our bodies, loving our experiences. It also is a point to and against kind of body negative theologies, right? That say that we're not worth it, right? We didn't deserve it, right? It says, no, we are worth it, right? We are chosen by God. We are created in God's image. We do have purpose, right? So all of these ways in which many times our faith narratives, Malcolm X says, who taught you to hate yourself, right? Our faith narratives often want to strip, right, our pride for ourselves. Redemptive self-love says, no, there's something to reclaim about ourselves and our bodies, right? About our lives and our stories, right? About our histories and our futures. And then critical engagement, right? This is the ability to engage the world at the intersection of oppression, knowing that particularly Black women have borne the brunt of social injustice throughout the history of the modern world. So when we talk about critically engaged preaching, it is always concerned every time we open up a text, right? Who are the persons on the margins in this text, right? And they will not be the same ones all the time, right? They will look different. They won't always be how we perceive them the last, right? Asking the questions to the text, who's missing from the story, right? Because there are always times we know who's there, but whose narrative didn't we get? When we read a text like Jephthah's daughter, what happened to Jephthah's mother, right? When we read, some of these texts, who's missing from these stories? Whose story often is missing? So this is about being able to critically engage or to discern, again, ways in which there might be an intersection of oppression. That who's missing question is often aligned with perhaps they're missing from the narrative because perhaps they are on the margins, right? They're the ones who have not given space or voice or opportunities to be heard. So the most recent text on womanist preaching is called The Womanist Preacher by Kimberly Johnson, and it's written with a particular lens towards rhetoric. And here's what I like, what she draws from what we just learned about radical subjectivity, right? Critical engagement, traditional communalism, and redemptive self-love. Here's what she says. What I discover is that radical subjectivity sermons speak truth to power by re-imaging a victim into a victor. Into a victor. Traditional communalism sermons call people back to their original beliefs and values. Redemptive self-love sermons honor those who unashamedly love themselves regardless by reimagining villains into heroines. And critical engagement sermons culturally critique the dominant normative views of society to help devise a plan that will fix societal problems, right? So keep these in your mind because we're going to do groups, and each of y'all have to come back with a sermon on one of these areas, right? So what is radical subjectivity? One more time. Yeah. It's right in the word, radical subjectivity, to place oneself at the center, right? And often to insert oneself at the center is already a radical act, right? Traditional communalism.
Bring you back to your roots.
Yeah. And thinking about ways in which the community, right? These multiple layered communities are part of this dialogue. Redemptive self-love.
Demystifying stereotypes and oppressive notions about Black women.
Yes. Critical engagement.
Naming what's wrong and offering a solution.
Absolutely, right? Being able to discern that kind of intersection of oppression. Some might call it's a little bit further than just a hermeneutic of suspicion, right? It's coming in the door knowing, right, that oppression is rampant, right? It's not saying perhaps, it's knowing that and trying to discern really where those conditions or contexts are. So let's shift gears a bit and talk a little bit more about millennials, right? We know what womanist preaching is. Why preach in womanist ways of being, doing, and thinking in a millennial context? So let's turn to kind of some of the kind of understanding this kind of our millennial audience and millennial context. It's important to know that millennials are technically now the largest living generation in this nation. We've beat the baby boomers and now exist as the largest living generation in the nation, which also makes millennials the most educated generation, particularly because 4 in 10 millennial persons have received a bachelor's or more. So this means that, again, no other generation before its time has had this most education. But unfortunately, many of these millennials are often, though they are educated, are not working jobs or equally compensated for the skills that they bring, right? So we have an influx or rise of student debt, right? And no way to repay those debts. Right? Because even though we have the education, we don't have the tools and resources to pay, right? This is the pews that we're preaching to every Sunday, right? Who have questions about tithing when they got student loan debts, right? Who have questions about stewardship, right? When they have, right? Who want, right, an educated word because they have likely, right, have degrees or multiple behind their names, right? So this gives us a little bit more context. What's also important is that millennials often lag behind in heading households, particularly because if they're unable to pay back student debt or not working jobs that adequately pay them, right? They're often still staying, kind of living still at home, so not establishing new households on their own, though millennial households are often more racially diverse than any other generation prior, but there are also more single mother heads of households in the millennial generation than we've seen in previous generations. 35% of millennials identify as nuns, according to Pew Research, which categorize them as atheists or agnostics, or have little emphasis on a religious identity. Because my work is just interested in black millennials in particular, 18% were found to be unaffiliated, whereas in comparison to white counterparts, 24%. So we've seen ways in which there is particular conversations about are millennials leaving the church, and then, who is really kind of interested in dialogue about faith and justice. What is important, though, again, is the pews. Who's in the pews? I like to call these the smart pews. Right? Millennials are in the pews, just as we think about who's kind of in our context. And this smart pews means that our preaching has to be connected to the pews in many ways, right? So we have to adopt somewhat of a smart kind of paradigm. What do I mean? Millennials are concerned with structure, right? They won't sit through a sermon that doesn't have a clear kind of end. A clear journey and a clear end, right? Right? So they want structure. They want a kind of clarity of voice and intention. They are willing to walk the journey with you if they are sure you're going somewhere. Right? They want meaning, right? Always trying to connect with how does this matter for myself and for my future? How does this connect with not only this kind of church moment, but my work and my family and career, right? Always thinking about what is the meaning behind this message, right? How does this fit with the kind of balance of faith and life and work, right? So they're interested in meaning making. Also interested in autonomy, right? Want the structure, right? But also don't want do's and don'ts, right? Want to be able to navigate their faith in ways in which they are led down a journey, but they can go through their own tunnels and roads and doors, right? They want to know they're going somewhere, but the curiosity to be able to chart their own course even as they go the distance. They're reader-friendly, right? If you look on Twitter, everybody gives everybody a read, right? And Twitter and other social media platforms have made cultural critics in a day, right? Anthropologists in 140 characters, right? Being very perceptive and able to add quick, insightful, witty, responsive, informed, right? Reactive sometimes responses, right? To what's happening in our cultural world. If millennials weren't reader friendly, there will be no Black Lives Matter, right? There would be no hashtag say her name, right? There would be none of these movements, right, that we are definitely informed by. It was because they were able to give a quick read, right, on their context and then respond to this. It is also the case that millennials are the generation that reads the most. It is the sense that blogs, not only just kind of book reading, but blogs keep millennials inundated, right, with content, right, that they have to parse through and read through. So it is important for us to know that they're reader friendly. And then lastly, technologically relevant, right? How can I tweet what you said, right? How can I use what has been shared through the preaching moment, through the sermon, in a way that can transition to technological platforms, right? So have a hashtag for your sermons, right? Have a way in which folks can follow the journey beyond you. If you don't have at least one tweetable moment, make sure you have one, right? Not only will it help your thesis to become sharper and stronger, but it'll also help folks to connect with it and actually extend, right, the message, again, beyond the Sunday morning sermon into that Monday through Saturday. Questions? So I am the co-creator of the Millennial Womanism Project, and part of my work in Millennial Womanism is trying to think about in what ways can womanism as a platform extend its work to not just kind of conversations within academic circles or even within church spaces as they move to kind of faith communities, but in the public square, right? How are we communicating about issues of eradicating oppression and so forth in social media and in other things? So I frame this around 4 things that I think that a womanist preaching in a millennial age must have. It must be radically loving. Part of that is this sense that we live in what I call the call-out culture, right? That is built around, and there is a virtue in calling out the issues, right? We ought to call out racism and sexism, right? And we ought to call out homophobia, right? And we ought to call out classism, right? And oppression, right? But sometimes this call-out culture leads to just calling out people, right? In order to embarrass or harangue them. So we have to find this delicate balance in not kind of leading to the call out because we're unafraid to call folk in, right? To have these necessary, intimate dialogue conversations. Not only are we a part of the call-out culture, but we're also a part of the cut-off culture, right? Where everyone wants to brag about, I let this person go to the left, everything you own in a box to the left, right? That we're constantly removing folk out of our lives, right? And not thinking about how can we struggle, right, with each other, right, in difficult moments. How can we really create meaningful, intimate relationships with each other that give folk time to evolve and give folk grace, right, to stand. Now, I understand safety is important. If someone is abusing you, of course, that's not the conversation. We're speaking to a love that liberates, right, a love that frees us, a love that is to life. But can we struggle through difficult conversations and difficult moments with each other in ways that don't just cut folk off, right? And then we live in a cast aside culture. You don't like it? Cast it aside, right? And often we see this happening, right, in our churches. Someone gets upset with you next day, we don't see the person the next Sunday, right? Knowing that this culture says if it's not working for you, push it to the side. I am not naive, right, that the church has its problems, right? We got too much sexism and patriarchy, right, that informs a good old boys club, right? We got too much lazy preaching, right, and bad membership. We have too much, right, too many issues, right, within our church, and we can go on, right? But there is a way in which we ought not cast aside, right, traditions, particularly faith traditions that have informed or birthed us, right, that have nurtured us. And so radical love speaks to this concept of how can we think about continuing to widen our circle, bringing folk in rather than pushing them out, right? And in fact, radical love for me is on top, much like Beyonce says, got my love on top, baby, right? It is essential that our work, our witness, our preaching, even as we call out sometimes, comes from a deep, profound love, right? That's why Micah says, do justice and love mercy, right? Or love mercifully. This is a kind of, again, a struggle with our love for each other. Justice seeking, right? A womanist preaching in a millennial age is concerned with this question of justice, right? And not justice in the way that has become so bland that we don't even understand what it is anymore, but justice in the form that oppression cannot have the last word, right? This again points back to that radical subjectivity in re-understanding ourselves and these texts, not by the victim, but by the victors. And then wisdom bearing. Wisdom bearing, again, goes back to this sense that the wise are not just the elder, right? The wise can also be the children, right? The child shall lead them, right? So there are ways in which we can negotiate how to seek and find and to understand the wisdom that exists in multiple generations, right? And to seek that wisdom. And then truth-telling, right? This goes back to Teresa Fry Brown's notion of honest, right, radical engagement. If you want to understand millennial communities, again, vulnerability and transparency starts with truth-telling, right? Being honest with ourselves as preachers, right? And who we are and what we bring to the text, right? Being honest about who we are and what we bring to this vocation, right? And then being honest and living a witness, right? That is vulnerable and transparent to even our parishioners. Questions? I see them. Yeah.
A lot of what you're saying with radical loving and the call out versus calling in culture, that has a lot to do with both parties respecting and having the face of the other acknowledged and cared for. So what happens in this womanist preaching in the middle age, trying to do radical loving, when there is no reciprocity of care and concern? That you're trying to radically love someone and they will not and cannot hear what you're saying or reciprocate that love.
Yeah, I mean, we have to go back to Walker's definition. Loves herself regardless, right? And there is a sense that to struggle sometimes with this love does not mean to put oneself in harm's way. That's why she also says, Walker says, not a separatist, but for health's sake. Meaning, at points, right, there may mean that I need to redirect or find another way or detach because it is harmful to my health. But if it's not, I'm going to try to struggle with it, right? I'm going to try to deal within the mess sometimes in order to make good creation. That's what God did, right? All right, so again, this is back to millennial womanism and follow our form. We are thinking very deeply about in what ways can we offer a counter-narrative to the story that's been told that millennials are leaving religion. What about all the millennials who have stayed, right? How do we account for their narratives and for their voices, right? And who are deeply concerned about faith and justice. And it is the case that the millennial kind of modifier on millennial womanism says, in what ways are there particular kind of issues, just as I named earlier, stuff like the pay gap, right? And the struggle for claiming own households and these are particular issues that are affecting this particular generation. What does a womanist word have to say to these conditions? So I have a few spotlights that I hope I can share. Millennial, and self-identify as womanist. And these sermons that I chose, we'll see the content of them being very kind of aligned with what we've talked about today. So I want to leave you with these kind of millennial spotlights. The sermons, hopefully we would have gotten to see them, but if you have questions about what sermons those are, I can direct you to those links. And that is directly connected to this sense that being able to make these sermons technologically relevant allows us to go back to them, right, at times like these. and for our own kind of Monday through Saturday stuff. And then the extensions of the platform, my work with the Millennial Womanism Project, you can follow us on all the networks at Millennial Womanism. Reverend Dr. Nichelle Guidry is of She Preaches. Go to shepreaches.com, all the networks there. We learned about Dr. Robinson's work with iHomiletic, and you can trace her work there. Black Millennial Cafe with Dr. Brianna Parker. You can trace her work there. Rise Together. I'm not sure if you've heard of the new kind of mentoring network with Union Seminary, but also connecting kind of these intergenerational conversations between women in ministry. And they'll also be across 7 kinds of states in the U.S. If you've heard of Just Two Pearls, another group of Black millennial women who are connecting on podcasts and extending their platforms there. Faith Matters Network is with Reverend Jennifer Bailey, and another kind of network of Black millennial women who are extending their platforms from the pulpit to www.shepreaches.com. Yep. Awesome. If you are a millennial and a womanist, we want to spotlight you. So send us your information. Again, all of our networks are at Millennial Womanism. And if you're going to Proctor Conference, join us for the Millennial Womanist track so we can have more dialogue and conversation. Thank you for sharing in this, and just want to leave you again with a kind of last statement that there is no gospel of Jesus Christ without women. And certainly understand that as you continue to walk your path.